Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is number 30 of the Dev Diaries for Victoria 3. Today we have the user interface overview, which is important because the user interface and the user experience in general, right, it has two main purposes. The first purpose is to inform you about things that are going on and about numbers, about facts that you need to know about, and the other one is to directly immerse you. The latter one is something that we very rarely talk about because as a consumer, as somebody that plays these games, that doesn't think about the design, right? That just looks at it, either has fun or doesn't have fun, and either enjoys things or doesn't enjoy things, you just know things intuitively. You look at something, you say that's good or that's bad. Why or how or what is better isn't something that you necessarily need to think about. You can, and I think it's a good thing to do that. I've been doing that much more actively ever since, of course, I started the YouTube channel, but basically, there is a big difference between, actually designing and thinking about design and then enjoying that or not enjoying it. And this is a bit of a look behind the scenes of how to design something, why it is designed this way, and how you immerse people with just a panel, with a button, right? How you get people interested in this time period. Now, what I will point out is that this is a great piece of art. This is today's loading screen, I assume, right? It definitely looks really, really neat. This is somebody that is trying to figure out, what is this? Maybe somebody that invents mechanical tools? This certainly looks like it, right? Either way, pretty cool image. Now, my name is Kenneth and I'm the 2D art lead on Victoria 3, working on the game's user interface UI. In short, with my team is a big part of what I do on the game. From here on, whenever the word UI is mentioned, it refers to an overview of these three categories: panels, buttons, and icons, which make up the UI of the game. The majority of the information and the decisions the player makes happens in the UI. I think that the UIs of grand strategy games and of strategy games in general are some of the most difficult things in game design in this genre that can be done and that have to be done. They're mandatory. You can't have a good game without a good UI. And I also think that most games struggle with it. Paradox, we don't need to talk about the XUIs that they did used to have. I mean, CK2, I love that game. I've literally 100%ed its achievements. Victoria 2, I love that game as well, even though I'm harsh on it. But I'm harsh on it because much of it doesn't work the way it should, right? But both of those have UIs where you are fighting the UI to get the information that you need. Victoria 2 looks superb. The immersion coming from the UI is great. I think the visuals are really, really neat. But the actual readability of the information that you need are horrendous, truly awful. And these two things need to work together. You need both of these sides, the aesthetically pleasing side and the functional side, for it to be a good UI. And in my opinion, Paradox has made many, many steps in recent years, just in the last few years, to really make their UI much more approachable. And then, of course, it's personal taste. It's very much subjective when it comes to the aesthetics, right? But again, I do want to stress, you should care about dev diaries like this one. Yes, it's not a mechanics dev diary, but this one is something that will define your time with the game. So let's take a look at what the art pillars are. What are the considerations that they put in when designing the UI? There are three core pillars. They have pillars for everything in Victoria 3. Prestigious. The UI is inspired by the extravagance and luxuries of the upper class in the Victorian era. It should feel elegant and exquisite. Vintage and idyllic. Vintage here means something from the past that is of high quality. The Romanticism art movement is a source of inspiration for the art direction. It seems fitting, given that it originated in the 1800s, and the idealization of the idyllic past and nature fits in nicely with the vintage feel that we want to incorporate into the UI. This is almost like a meta commentary on making a game about an idealized past. Either way, listen, this is a very interesting approach. It's a classic approach. You try to put it into the time period of this moment, but you need to be very careful because Romanticism in particular, of course, is very, very embellished. The stylization of it is extreme. And when you deal and when you work with that style, you need to do it in a way where it's still approachable and detailed, which is good because that's the third pillar. High level of detail with intricate elements, but used sparingly so it does not become cluttered and overwhelming. Let's see how they did. With the first part here, which are the UI panels. We chose to incorporate Art Nouveau elements into the panels. Art Nouveau is primarily inspired by nature and the natural forms and curves of plants and flowers. This aligns with the art pillar vintage and idyllic. The style is also prominent in the architecture of the upper echelons of society in the 1800s. Its intricate details evoke a feeling of extravagance and elegance, which aligns with the other two art pillars. We need to be careful not to put in too many detailed patterns, however, as this will distract the main function of a UI, which is to display information to the player. We can see it right here. This is interesting to see because we can't just see it in the actual panel, we also see it in the font. Let's take a look at this. So right here, this is just the top. It's just the header that says, hey, this is what this panel is all about. buildings. You can see there are intricate floral patterns in the background. You can see that there is embellishment here, you know, in these locations that is a bit more extravagant than the embellishment right here. The gold frame right here is literally much more simpler than this over there. And then down here we have, it looks like a diamond pattern to me, right? That's what this is basically, but it's really light, really simple, and it's something that is over this entire window. It's a very simple style that still keeps the overall style of this window, but very clearly there is a distinction here. The top can be more embellished because you don't see much information in there. It's just a header that tells you, yep, this is the buildings panel. But then down here it gets simpler. The B in buildings, very much embellished. Look at this, and then look at the rest, right? Much more simple. This is a basic approach to UI design that most certainly I think is very valuable. Now, what I have seen, and where I can definitely partially agree with it, is that this UI maybe still feels a bit too modern when you actually look at it, right? But I gotta tell you, I personally feel that this might be primarily an issue of not being used to it. I think once you see it in action, we haven't seen a single moving section of Victoria 3, which is just infuriating, quite frankly. I really want to see some gameplay as well. But we haven't seen any of that. And maybe in action, it feels more natural. It feels more, you know, fitting to the time period. Again, I'm not saying it's not. I personally actually really like what they did, especially here with the header. This is a bit blank, but it needs to be blank because there's so much else going on here. What the actual feeling in the game is, I mean, we can't really tell. But you can see the design pillars here without a doubt, in my opinion. It is very clear in, you know, the areas where it needs to be clear, and then up here it is very much embellished. Then we have the buttons. Buttons are the main elements in the game and UI that the player interacts directly with. From the UX point of view, players would need to identify the buttons almost instantaneously. Not all games do that, honestly. I've seen so many games where I can't tell whether something is clickable or whether it's not clickable or whether there's a reaction to it. What happens if I click the button? Buttons are more important than you think. Buttons should be identified either as navigation buttons or as action buttons. So either something that brings you into a different section of the UI or that does something. With that in mind, we sought to create a template for the game's buttons while aligning it with our core art pillars. We use wood as texture for the buttons for the aged vintage feel. All buttons have an emerald color with 2 different shades to differentiate between action and navigation buttons. This is a navigation button. This is an action button. You can also see action buttons also have a thin gold border to differentiate them further, while still having both types recognized as buttons. Very simple, very clear, you will recognize this immediately. Even here, obviously this is just a mock-up, this is just an example, but my god, what I will say about this game's UI, where I'm not sure whether I love it, is many of the buttons that we have seen, they take so much space. They could be so much smaller, but that is a style choice at the end of the day, right? There would be some UI screens that would have multiple buttons on them. How can we draw attention to higher priority buttons, if any? Our solution, give them a more prestigious look by adding Art Nouveau elements around the borders and corners of the button. This looks nice. I really enjoy the general Art Nouveau style that they have chosen here, both for the buttons, but of course also for the actual elements in the UI panels. Looks really sweet. Now we have icons as the last section. Icons in the game come in a wide variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and colors, and we use them to represent a host of different things, mechanics, statistics, and attributes in the game. I will break down some of the different ways in which we use the icons, and hopefully you all will gain a better insight into our design process. Buildings and goods. So yeah, these are buildings. They are very clearly much more realistically, you know, this is basically a drawing where you just see mini illustrations of what this would actually look like in this situation, in this building, in this production site. We have different industries here. The government building, I think this is an administrative building. This is clearly cloth production. This is a cocoa plantation. This is coffee plantation. What is this? Whale oil, maybe? So like something fishery, right? This is, of course, food production. So this is a wheat farm. Then right here we have, well, everything related to food. Honestly, these icons are amazing. I really like the goods icons. They look so good. They're so detailed, and yet you can very clearly see what it is. No, I really like this. This is the style that I really enjoy in this game. Events, technologies, and pop groups. Academia and dynamite are both technologies that a player can research, but one seems to be a little abstract, while dynamite is an actual object in real life. So how do you do it? For technology and event icons, we decided to use objects from the real world, or several objects to represent them. Since most of these icons are going to be pretty big for an icon, we decided to go for a highly detailed and realistic rendering to enhance immersion. I really like all of these. So these are tech icons that you will see in the tech screen, for example, maybe, I don't know, in I don't know where you might see this, honestly. Like, mostly in the tech screen, of course, that is where you will definitely see them, but maybe there's an event if you get a technology, and then you see them as well. I don't know, but these here, So these are within the journal system that will be shown off next week. Very excited for that, because we've been waiting for it for such a long time. But all of these look great. I'm in love with these icons. That looks really neat. It just, like, again, shows you very clearly what it is about, but it's so detailed. The first district is voting, for example, then the news right here, the gears turning, right, whether it's industrialization, whether it's technology, and then this right here is the protest event. Man, these just look good. Now here comes something that is very important to me personally, because I've been a big fan of Paradox moving into this direction, of any grand strategy game moving into this direction. But I know that this is somewhat controversial in the fan base, because there are obviously some people, and understandably so, I'm not saying they're wrong at all, it's a preference thing, right? But there are people that are saying that this addition isn't really necessary. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Pop groups are represented by our amazing character models and icons. Since the character models will be a tad hard to see when scaled down, we use icons to support them. The same guidelines apply when designing pop icons. For example, machinists are represented by a wrench. This is them, French Catholic machinists in Algiers. They are unemployed, struggling, and so on. The thing that I want to bring up here is, and it was brought up very early on into this dev diary, it was mentioned as one of the core ideas of UI, right, is that UI doesn't just deliver information to you, it also wants to immerse you. I am a huge fan of 3D characters, pop groups, and so on in these games. And I know that some people, again, and justified, it's personal preference at the end of the day, believe that this isn't necessary, that it's just clutter, they don't need it, they don't want it. I would just like to point out as to why this is happening. Why is Paradox putting these into the game? If you accept that UI is something that needs to also immerse you, not just events immerse you, it needs to be the UI, and I think everybody can agree on this, then it must be pointed out that if you have pops, that you can look in the eye and you can see them struggling, that you have pops and you can see them doing well, that has a much greater effect on your decision making. And I'm not saying it will always impact you, I'm not saying at some point you'll just ignore it, right, because you might, but it has a much greater baseline effect than just this icon. Oh, look at that. My machinists, who are represented by wrenches, or in Victoria 2, just represented as a 2D image that every single, well, machinists, but work, for example, a clerk, or whatever else you have in Victoria 2, right? They're just represented by 2D static images. They will make it much easier for you to just fall into this sort of number behavior. Oh, you're doing poorly? Well, I don't really care, because statistically speaking, you can't rise up. Who gives a hell? Who cares, right? This, on the other hand, you will look at them and you will say, hey, you know what, maybe I can do something for these pops, maybe I can do something there. Whether you will always be guided by it, certainly not. I mean, we all play CK3 and we all still assassinate children every now and again, right? But I hope you know where I'm coming from. The step to 3D was very, very important in the sense that it gives another alleyway for UI designers, for game designers, to try and immerse you into the gameplay. If my character in CK2 got wounded, got a sickness, I didn't really care. Yeah, the portrait changed slightly with the texture, but I've seen that same texture 1,000 times. Who cares about it? But if my character gets wounded and I see the actual, and my god, it looks horrendous in CK3 when they actually take damage. Seriously, it looks god-awful, in the sense that it looks disgusting because it looks so good. But if they get wounded, I feel much more personally about that than if it's just a CK2 sprite. So, yeah, I just want to stress, this is why they're doing it. You don't need to agree with it, but I want to bring this closer because I think there's a bit of a disconnect there. Some people say it's just clutter, but it really isn't. It's a core function of the UI to immerse you, and this is a big part of it. I'm a huge fan of the 3D representations. Can they be better? They can always be better, and never give up demanding better, right? That's very important, but what I'm talking about, this step is big for UI immersion design. Now, the final group of icons I'm going to talk about is a broad group which represents game mechanics, their categories, attributes, and stats. These icons tend to show up in multiple different UI screens and are not very big for an icon. They may need to appear in different sizes as well. Many of them would need to be recognizable when they are small, therefore we reduce the amount of details on these icons drastically and instead focus on a few choice colors and the silhouettes. This seems in general like a bit of an artist mock-up, right? Because there's a lot of stuff next to each other. This is like I think this is the general army window overview, right? Yeah, we have the generals, you can mobilize them. We've seen this before, and you can see the icons. This is an icon that is very small. It's never going to be big. This is basically the biggest icon. The skull, the navies right here, that sort of stuff, right? And you need them to be very precise, concise, and to still have uniqueness to them. We're going to take a look at them in a second as well. This Diploplay mockup is just amazing. Everybody's at maximum strength, apparently maxed out. And then right here you can see how it would look if it maybe got a bit cluttered. You know, that's a lot of countries supporting somebody, that sort of stuff. And they need to design the UI around it. Here we can see Brazil attacking somebody. Posadas, are they attacking Uruguay? Maybe Argentina? Is this Piratini? It might be. Honestly, I don't know. But yeah, there goes a lot into this. For example, this disaster icon. It never needs to be huge, but you need to be clear about it. This soldier icon, you can see it right here, you can see it there, and you can see it there. It needs to be very clear what it is. It needs to be similar to one another, even in different sizes, because you need to be able to identify it, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. We have the soldier icon right here, applied in different sizes. Then we have color coding, right? That comes, of course, from modifiers. The condition icons that are green are positive, and then the red ones are negative. I assume this might be like loyalty, this might be radicalism, this might be you get money, you lose money. This is also radicalism, actually, or positive and negative rebellions, that sort of stuff. And these look like inventions and how they influence research rate. Interest group icons are a more complex example of color coding. Players may not immediately remember and understand all the color coding within each subcategory of icons, but our hope is that this will get more familiar and identifiable over time. Other examples of this lens are lens category icons, right? The lenses we saw here as well, they definitely have a very distinct color coding system. You can also see that green always is used for money, usually, of course, you know, makes sense because of the dollar. That's where that comes from. Red is for war, that makes a lot of sense as well. Building is this sort of golden thing. Diplomacy, no, this is laws, actually. Honestly, I would switch these two around, but then you have the golden next to the other golden one, much too closely, so maybe not, right? But I would switch these colors around. Laws have more of a golden character to me, and blue is diplomacy in my mind. But anyway, and then the interest groups also have very clear color coding that are a bit leaning towards the political spectrum, I would say, right? We have red, the trade unions, that will eventually, very likely, become socialists. Then industrialists, intelligentsia lean towards the gold of liberalism and so on, right? Green are the rural folk, so that is something that has to do with nature. Petite bourgeoisie are urban, are conservative, quite likely, right? Yeah, the color coding, I'll be honest with you, this is very, very clear. I can already recognize most of them, and the game isn't even anywhere near to being out, right? Right, and then here we have the last section, tutorial. In the previous dev diary, Aaron and Henrik have briefly mentioned the tutorial. I'm going to talk a little about the art that goes into helping players understand our incredibly deep and complex mechanics better. We believe that the combination of tooltips, text explanations, and infographics will help visualize the game mechanics better. Most infographics you find online, go ahead, do a Google search, have a clean, stylized, and very modern look. We see an opportunity here to make it fit with the Victorian era better. This can definitely be an era where immersion is enriched and of course strengthen our art pillars. We took inspiration from newspaper illustrations and blueprint illustrations of the Victorian era and adopted it for our infographics. And as an icing on the cake, we overlaid the drawings on top of an aged paper background. I wonder what the tutorial in Victoria 3 will look like. Because this looks like, okay, you the player, this is your country, and you will interact with the country via politics, economics, diplomacy, and war. Do they just like show you this? Because CK3's tutorial, but CK3 has way fewer complex mechanics to explain than Victoria 3. And that one was really good. Will Victoria 3 basically come like with an infographic about here's how the state works? The populace, they vote or they don't vote, you know? I wonder how that goes. But this is, yeah, it's an interesting infographic. I just wonder how useful it actually is to learn the game. I guess this is more of an understanding thing. It's a nice looking infographic anyway. Now, this is the end of this dev diary. Next week, Daniel, our content design lead, I believe this is Daniel Tollman, will be talking about journal entries. Daniel Tollman has been doing the after action reports, most of them anyway, in the Discord. Now, I was initially thinking I'd do the monthly update video in this video, but you know what? I'm going to do it in a different video, in a separate video, because I need to go. Let me know what you think about the UI, whether you like the aesthetics, and most importantly to me personally, what you think about 3D characters in video games that are grand strategy games. Let me know, and I'll see you later, alligator.